Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to, perhaps, Natia, you can pin all four of us, thanks. A warm welcome to the researchers session in today's mentoring conference. It's an international session with people from Spain, Ireland, and all over Europe, France, and, well, if I see the audience correctly, even more countries. The goal of today's meeting is to talk about research and to take a specific look at the added value of research for our work. I would also say in my terms to just a little bit fall in love.
Oh.
We cannot hear you.
Yeah.
The microphone is on.
You are muted.
Yeah, you can turn it on and then we will hear you.
Is it better? What a stress, don't we just hate this? Okay, sorry people, we go for it again. So a warm welcome for this researcher session on mentoring and research to learn from what we can learn from research. My name is Sylvia Shimon. I'm community manager of Mentoring Europe, a network organization we started some 6 years ago to create a community of mentoring programs and researchers in Europe to learn from each other and to change and collaborations, also research and practice collaborations, to be able to do our work better. And today we are with 3 scholars, which is fantastic, and with 3 very different angles on mentoring. I would say when we take a look at research, the way I look at it at least is 2 angles why I eagerly follow everything there is in the field of mentoring research. One is to collect evidence and to understand what is the effect and the impact of our work, practitioners. And that's what we very often learn from the evaluation work of people like Bernardine and Oscar. The other reason is to understand better under which condition we can do our work better. So what are the elements in our work that we can improve or give more focus so that the effectivity or the quality of our work grows? So that's basically my passion in following research. I also noticed in the first 15 years of my work, I used to be a mentoring practitioner, and I was there for all the presentations and publications that was possible, and you always pick up small sentences from researchers. And some of my favorites were, for example, when I listened to a keynote from Bernardine and your colleague Pat, how you emphasize the empathy that is needed on the side of mentors and connectedness, to listen to youth's voice. I just loved it, that sentence, to listen to youth's voice in mentoring programs. It's so evident, but still we sometimes forget. I saw in one of your work, Oscar, how you spoke about the sense of belonging and how safety grows on the side of immigrant young people when they had a mentor. It's sometimes almost natural, but still, that you see the data on it, that it does grow, the sense of belonging on the side of your population. And what I also love as a statement from American researchers, how they keep saying, mentoring is not one size fits all. And again, a very simple statement, but it's a huge message for us practitioners to keep working in a tailor-made way. So in any case, obviously I love research. I do hope you will fall in love today with it as well. By the help of Agnes, Bernardine and Oscar, we agreed we will use first names today to make it a bit shorter. And before we dive into your work, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself, the university that you're connected to, and your function or speciality. Would you do that first, just in 1 minute, and then I give you the floor to introduce more of your work. Oscar?
Hi, everyone. This is Oscar.
I can't hear myself.
Can you hear me? No? Yeah,
Yes.
I think the rest of
We
you
can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bernardine, you hear Oscar?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think.
Oh,
Yeah, I can hear
everyone.
Oscar. Yeah.
I can't believe it. I can't hear it myself.
Okay.
Okay, Oscar, talk, please. Talk.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. This is Oscar Prieto Flores. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at the School of Education and Psychology at the University of Girona, Catalunya, northeast Spain. And I've been involved in mentoring research since 15 years ago. Actually. Yeah. Last day I was talking with Bernardine and I said 10, but
No,
it's
not.
15.
15 years now.
Time flies, yeah.
Two of you are the diehards in Europe of the mentoring research. Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you, Oscar. Bernardine?
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Bernardine Brady, and I'm a lecturer in the School of Political Science and Sociology in the National University of Ireland in Galway in the west of Ireland. So I work for an organisation as well called the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, and we have been doing research on all aspects of youth mentoring for, I think, almost 20 years now. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing some of our learning with you today.
Thanks, Bernardine. Agnes, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Agnes Van Zanten. I'm a senior research professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and I am mostly interested in inequalities in education and more recently in inequalities of access to higher education and widening participation practices.
Okay. Thank you so much, Agnes, for joining us, because you can really highlight for us how mentoring connects to different social educational challenges as an extra instrument. So looking forward to hear from you. Okay, just for your understanding how the session will go, we have a chat box where you can place your questions. Feel free to type in anything. Mattia will be moderating it and asking the questions. In the first part of this roundtable, I will ask each researcher to tell about your work, and then we will open up an open conversation. So in the first, I would say 20 minutes, you will hear a presentation of Bernardine, Oscar, and Agnes about your work. Okay? Do you have a preference in who goes first, Oscar, Bernardine?
I think we can follow the order that was established at the beginning.
Okay, Oscar, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I will share the screen.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to just present some of the last research outcomes that we have from a research project we finished last year about the effectiveness of mentoring programs in Spain, in the Spanish context. And we are going to connect these outcomes with other evidence in the field from US and other European countries about the lessons that we can learn from research, from this specific research in the Spanish context especially. So this research that I'm going to present is the Applying Mentoring. It's a research with different Spanish universities, UMass Boston as well, and some foundations, NGOs. And one of the things or the main aims of this research project was to assess 3 different types of mentoring programs, especially seeing that mentoring programs are various. They have various target populations as well. And we wanted to assess 3 different types of mentoring programs addressing the needs of different populations as well. You know? One was focused on adolescent population. All of them are migrant and refugee population. Adolescent population. Another one was focused on unaccompanied youth from 18 to 23 years old, especially in an age of transition to adulthood, coming of age. And finally, a mentoring program especially focused on asylum seekers and supported by adult population. So one of the main aims of this project was assessing these outcomes, but we could not do that without the support and the active collaboration and participation of NGOs doing the mentoring. So we believe that mentoring research should be, and as our Irish colleagues are doing, with research practitioners partnerships, no? Together with organizations and end users to reach our goals. So this research was based on the growth of mentoring programs in Spain. We experienced growth in mentoring programs since 2015 on. And one of the main drivers of this increase was the so-called migrant refugee crisis. And a lot of organizations started to build new mentoring programs in order to accompany migrant youth and migrant refugees. The thing is that in our Spanish context, we didn't have evidence from our reality. So the evidence that we can see in order to improve the quality of our mentoring programs in the Spanish and Catalan context was to see other research that had been carried out in different contexts, like the United States, for example. And one of the things that we see is that most, let's say 90% of publications are or research based on mentoring programs are in the US context, based in the US context. We are trying to change these dynamics, and we are having more and more evidence from the European context as this specific project. But what the evidence says to us, and I think this is really important, is that mentoring programs could also have negative effects to youth, and to avoid these iatrogenic effects, to these negative effects on youth, it's really, really important. So we can see that there is evidence showing us that there are a lot of mentoring programs having small, medium effects, but there are also mentoring programs that are also having negative effects, and this should be like an alarm clock, no, in our heads, saying and alert us that we should avoid negative practices. The thing is that through the exploration of the mentoring programs we carried out through our research, we could see that at least in those that we were exploring, there were no negative effects, and the positive effects that we saw is that mentoring programs are like being acting as a protective protection, like a shield, no, to adolescents, for example, that they are engaged in high schools. We can see that we carried out a pre and post test to adolescents, youth that were participating in a mentoring program, and other groups, a waiting list control group that was not participating in the mentoring practice. And we could see that those who were participating at least were keeping on track during their school academic year, while those who were not participating were going down. And so this kind of mentoring has an effect, at least, of keeping people on track in their educational trajectories, which is, at least for our side, I think it's an interesting outcome. And another thing that we observe, lessons that we can learn from these mentoring programs and the effects that these mentoring programs are doing, is that they can, by creating a safe space with their mentees are engaged more in class. They participate more in class, and their teachers are seeing them that these students should be as soon as possible translated into the ordinary class, because some of these students are migrants and are in special dispositives, and they are not 100% of the time in the ordinary class. And for the mentoring programs, the effect that the mentoring program has on unaccompanied youth, we could see that there is a substantial improvement in resilience, hope, and self-esteem. And they were more able to reflect on their trajectories and to establish new educational expectations. And that was a really relevant impact. The program on youth, on accompanied youth, was the highest effect size among the rest, and we think that maybe this is because they are the population with a higher risk. But one of the things lessons that we can learn, and this is these lessons from these research projects connected to the body of research that we have, is that targeted programs, targeted mentoring programs, or well-targeted mentoring programs are more effective, or can be more effective than those which are not non-specific. For targeted mentoring programs, we can say that we have a very clear targeted population through which we can focus, we can set specific and clear goals, and mentors can help with these specific goals and trying to give an answer to the real needs of the mentees. And through this research, we also connected the outcomes of this research with other issues that are relevant in the field. There are different types of mentoring programs. The mentoring can be conceptualized as mentoring as a friendship, as a relationship, a friendship relationship to promote a safe space, and that's all. Mentoring can also be conceptualized as a focus on specific needs, youth employment, youth educational trajectory, access to the university, for example, or it can be focus on a specific transition that youth or an adult is living or experiencing. But we can, what we observe in at least from our experience and research, was that the combination of these three elements were very interesting and successful. So mentoring is effective with some focus and with some specific needs if there is a friendship relationship, and if there are at the beginning, especially, there are relationship building activities, because otherwise learning, as you know, tend to happen when there is someone that you care about. No, someone that you care about is you learn from them more than other people. No? And especially it becomes especially effective in transitional moments of people. So for concluding, I would like to just highlight that besides the effective elements of mentoring programs, the structural basic elements that we can see in the literature and through the guidelines that we have from US scholars, our US friends, and mentoring programs, it is also relevant to have a well-defined target group, to know their specific needs from a critical approach, and to develop skills in mentors so they can share with mentees how to navigate through the system. And what is really important is who creates the narrative of the mentoring program. Is the funder? Is we think that this specific group or collective needs and a specific clear necessity, or we can create a space for these youth or other people to talk about their needs and trying to align the program target with these specific needs. And these are more or less the highlights I wanted to share with you from our experience in Spain. Thank you.
Now, that was a lot of content, Oscar. Lot of
too much.
whoa. So we'll have to get back to it in the later on in this session. But Oscar, I do have a question right now, the last one you mentioned, because I think it was very clear on, can you also pin Oscar? Okay. I think it's very clear, your message on the effect of mentoring, but also the being targeted, focused, the goal setting. Very interesting to hear about transitional mentoring. I've never heard about that. But the last thing you mentioned is who creates the narrative. I don't understand that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, about the first question about the transition, we are all living in moments of transition. So, for example, a child that is going from school to high school. No, they are in a new setting, and these adolescents need support. And for example, or a migrant that just arrive, or an asylum seeker that arrives from Syria, from any part of the world, to a new place. No, so there are moments of transition. If we carry out mentoring programs in these moments of transitions, okay, I think, and we can identify all these things. The effects seems to be higher. Wow. And about the narrative is that, for example, I was thinking that maybe we are like, for example, we are going to create this specific mentoring program for these youth, no? And we are going to do these activities with them. But maybe we are not taking into account their voice, and they drop out from the mentoring program because they are not interested in what they perceive that they can be helped, no? And it is relevant in some cases, especially when we are establishing a new mentoring program, is to listen this specific group, and to create like a space of cooperation with them in order to establish those needs. That's
very powerful, and not a lot of people who talk about that. So basically, you suggest to place our target group centrally in shaping our mentoring programs, that they have a voice in what our mentoring services should look like.
I think this should be more humanizing, at least, and more.
I'm loving it. That's a very powerful sound. I'm not sure if it's up to me, but it's not something I hear a lot. I know that Bernardine's colleagues also talk in that spirit, but for the rest, we tend to forget it to listen to people. Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much, Oscar. Mattia, are there any questions in the audience that you would like to handle now? Otherwise, we move on. Yeah, we move on. Bernardine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sylvia, and thanks, Oscar. That was really interesting. There's so many points you made, Oscar, that I was nodding furiously. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our experience of doing research in mentoring in Ireland. So all of my research has been associated with Foróige, which is a national youth organisation, and they manage and run the Big Brothers Big Sisters youth mentoring programme in Ireland. So it's a highly established, very well established programme that very much is based on best practice in terms of mentoring practice. So I suppose in the early days, we started talking to people in Foróige about their work, and we decided to do a small scale study of the mentoring program. So we started off just doing some focus groups with mentors, some interviews, some surveys with mentors and with young people. And from that, we started to build up some understanding, I suppose, of how the program works, how young people find it beneficial, how mentors find it beneficial, and so on. So I suppose that was very helpful, and we used that learning to, I suppose, to feed back into improving the program, developing practices, extending new areas of practice. And then I suppose as time went on, we realized that the organization for OIGA, they wanted to secure more permanent funding, because most of the funding for mentoring in Ireland comes from small grants, and there's very little mainstream funding. So they realized that in order to access mainstream government funded funding, they needed a higher level of evidence of impact of mentoring. So we decided to design a study that was more ambitious and that would capture evidence that policymakers would find useful. So when we're doing research on social interventions, as some of you will know, that the ideal type or the gold standard is the randomized control trial. So this is where you take a group of young people who are similar and who would be your target group for the program, and half of them receive the intervention and the other half doesn't. And you compare, you do measures with both groups at the start, and then you compare the measures over time. And I suppose it enables you to see if the specific program you're evaluating is making an impact or not. So we got funding to undertake a randomized control trial, and around 2007, and we completed it in 2011. So we had a 2-year study, and we took measures at 4 points in time over the 2 years. But in order to design the study, we needed to have a theoretical model or a logic model to help us to pick which measures we wanted to focus on. So we used a theoretical model of how mentoring works that had been developed by Professor Jean Rhodes in the United States, who is probably the leading mentoring researcher in the world. So based on Rhodes' model of mentoring, our hypothesis was that mentoring would result in improved emotional well-being for the young people involved, that it would improve their attitudes to school and improve their engagement with school, that it would lead to reduced risk behaviors such as drug use or violence, that they would have better perceived social support, and that they would have better relationships with parents and peers. So I should have said at the start, the target group were kind of roughly young people between 10 and 18 who were identified to be at risk in various ways. So we included measures of all these dimensions in our study. It was a quantitative survey that was completed where we included measures of these dimensions over the 4 time points over the 2 years. And we also undertook, as part of this study, a qualitative strand where we interviewed young people, parents, mentors, and caseworkers about their experiences of the mentoring relationship. And we also collected data on the program practices in terms of, you know, how often supervision was done, how often the matches met, say the mentor and the mentee met, how frequently they met, and those kinds of program implementation data as well. So I suppose at the end, we had a huge amount of data that enabled us to see the outcomes, I suppose, if mentoring works, and also then the process data and the implementation data, which helps us to see which aspects of the program were associated with positive outcomes and which were not. So the findings of our study, we were really excited after so much work to see. We were waiting with bated breath to see what the final results would be after such a long time and involving a lot of people. So we found some good news and some slightly disappointing news. So the good news was that we found that the youth mentoring program had a statistically significant impact on young people's emotional well-being, in particular their sense of hopefulness about the future and their feelings of having support in their lives. some of the more disappointing news was that we had some positive trends in our data relating to education, risk behavior, but they weren't statistically significant. So I suppose this is one of the challenges with research, that sometimes your samples aren't big enough to be able to find these types of impacts. So we could see lots of positive indications, but possibly because our sample wasn't big enough, we had 164 young people in our sample, we didn't have enough power to really find some of these outcomes. But having said that, there were a lot of positive indications from the research, and also we found some really interesting insights from our qualitative study. So I suppose randomized control trials, while they are the gold standard of research, intervention type research, they're very complicated, they're very expensive, they're very challenging. You need to, Oscar talked about the importance of partnerships between researchers and practitioners. We had very, very close relationships with practitioners, and that was really important to make sure that there was buy-in for the studies. So I suppose it took us a few years to recover from from doing that big study. We were exhausted. And I suppose in recent years, we have continued to do research on mentoring, but most of the research we've done over the last few years has been qualitative studies. So I fully agree with Oscar's point around, I suppose, I feel very strongly that sometimes young people in mentoring programs are treated as objects, that, you know, researchers go and design measures that they administer to young people without asking the young people what they want to get out of the program, or whatever the case may be. Whereas with qualitative studies, I really like them because you're giving the power over to the young person to describe in their own words what they feel is working for them, what the meaning of the relationship is to them, how it particularly impacts on their lives. So I've been involved in studies in the past 5 years with young people involved in the youth justice system who have mentors, with young people in mental health services, with young people in the care system. And it's really interesting talking to them about their own particular stories and how mentoring works for them. One common thread that comes out is that these young people tend to have a lot of professionals involved in their lives, like social workers or psychologists. And you would think that possibly having another person intervening would not be welcome, but actually they really value the non-formal aspect of mentoring. They really appreciate the fact that the person is doing this on a voluntary basis, that they're there as their friend. They're not there with any specific objective in mind. So they really value it as a space where they can, you know, get away from the realities of their lives and just have fun and spend time with somebody that they enjoy spending time with. But actually, a lot of positive outcomes do accrue from this, from having this positive relationship, that it actually impacts on their emotional well-being, which helps them to do better at school because they're not getting into trouble so much at school. It helps them to become more social and more outgoing, so they get more involved in community activities and they build their social capital. It helps them to develop an idea about what kind of a future they'd like to have, which increases their motivation around education. So, you know, sometimes I think with social interventions, we're too focused on the intervention piece, and we kind of lose sight of the human dynamic and the human relationship. So I suppose in recent years, I've come to really appreciate qualitative studies because they really help us to get those insights. So I'll stop talking now, Sylvia. Thank you.
No, perfect timing, perfect timing. I'm so happy to hear that, because in the last 10 years, every time I spoke to researchers, they struggle with, we see the positive results, but the data don't show it. And then you have all this struggle, like, does RCT study, does that really work for us? And then you just hear more and more often that perhaps the qualitative research that brings the real depth. And I read your last book. Help me with the title, Bernardine. Mentoring for young people. Help me.
In care and living care. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful work. So people out there, even if you are not a mentoring program for young people in care, it's just a beautiful collection of mentees' stories also on mentoring, how they think it's beautiful that it's so full of quotes as well.
Oh, thanks, Sylvia.
Okay, thank you, Bernardine. Clear message also on this very vulnerable group of young people that you researched. I know that in France in recent years, especially past year, there's a lot of attention to set up mentoring programs for the most vulnerable. So you're encouraged to take a look at Bernardine's work. Let's not do any further questions then, but I would like to really move to, I think, very clear, very strong story, Bernardine. We will zoom in later on. Let's move to Agnes to hear about your work on educational social science in France and a bit of link to mentoring. Thank you, Agnes. I don't hear Agnes myself. I think you're muted. There is a way to.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's good.
So thank you. As I said before, I do research on inequalities in education, and my most recent work in the last 10 years has been on inequalities of access to higher education and widening participation programs. So I'm not an expert on mentoring, but I met some mentoring programs in the work I was doing on access to higher education, and I would like to say something about both the more general framework and also on these French mentoring programs. So first, the general framework. So if we focus on access to higher education, well, there are different ways in which we can measure access to higher education. For instance, we can take into account levels of enrollment in higher education. We can also take into account rates of success in higher education. I also think it's very important, especially in systems like the French one, which is very fragmented and hierarchical. We also have to take into account the different types of higher education where students go to, either 2-year programs, 4-year programs, but also the prestige of the different institutions they go to, the type of tracks they follow. And in my own work, which is mostly qualitative, although sometimes I collaborate with some quantitative researchers, I have focused on the main reasons for social inequalities in access to higher education. The more central reasons that we know and that are very structural and difficult to change have to do, of course, with students' background and with their school trajectory. So, and also the track they have followed in school. So these are factors which are very important and that demand very structural solutions. But there are also things that intervene when students are preparing for access to higher education, and my work focuses more on that. So one of the problems has to do with the fact that young people don't get the same level and the same type of guidance depending on the school they go to. So we found striking differences in the type of guidance that students got schools, in the degree of personalization of guidance, in the degree at the moment in which guidance started, the kind of advice that was given to the student. So there were very important differences. And one thing that is also very important are the selection mechanisms that are developed by higher education institutions, but also to fill the gap because of the lack of guidance in school. What the French government has done, which is also done in many other countries as well, is to provide a lot of digital information, and there are many programs going on. And one of the things I have focused in my research is that there are strong social inequalities in how students can use digital information. So that, I think, is the main question, the main issue. And a second important issue is that I think that because of lack of guidance, there are a lot of market actors with a lot of vested interest in guidance that are intervening in the sector, and not always with very good consequences for students. For instance, I have done a very large study of higher education fairs, showing what happens in higher education fairs. And I don't have the time to tell you what happens, but it's not always very good for the students. Now I come to the mentoring program. So the other side of the story is that partly to help with this situation where many young people in secondary education don't get enough guidance now that many are pursuing their studies in a higher education, and also because the most selective higher education institutions in France came under much attack, which has been the case as well in England or in the US and in many other countries. They got involved in developing new mentoring programs for various reasons, to help the students, to improve their image. So there were different factors that were considered. Some of these programs have now become quite sophisticated because they have lasted for something like 20 years now. But many of them are very simple, and many of them, because the government created a policy which is called Team for Success. Many higher education institutions are doing these programs, but they are doing them in a kind of wild way, without working with researchers, without any monitoring or evaluation. So there are many problems involved in how these mentoring programs go about. And I will just list them because I don't have much time, but I can go back to some of these questions. So part of the problem has to do with the training of the people who are involved in the program. So many of these programs, the main actors are higher education students that get very little or no training at all. So it sometimes works very well because there are a lot of identification processes that work very well. But sometimes it's not so well, and there is a lot. And just to quote a very famous French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, there is a lot of symbolic violence going on as well in some of these programs that I documented. There is also mentoring from the business sector. And some of this mentoring can be very good for students. They get a lot of information that they don't know about access to jobs and what are employers asking for. But many times mentors consider that there is a transfer between what they do and access to higher education. And there is no automatic transfer at all. Other problems have to do with the short-term character of the program. It's very difficult to change students' attitudes and behavior just with the program in the last year of high school. A big problem is lack of coordination with the schools. So in many cases, the teachers in the schools are not involved in the problems. As I said before, very little monitoring and evaluation. And the last thing I wanted to say, and I think this is very important, is that I consider guidance, tutoring, mentoring an important element, but all the evidence we have in all countries in the world show that in order to improve access to higher education, there has to be a combination of three factors. If we want to reduce inequalities in access to higher education, we have, of course, to provide guidance before students access higher education, and after they enter into higher education, they still need support. But we also have to change the selection system, and we have to provide financial help to students in different ways. When these three factors are combined, then we find very successful programs. But this is a model that is rarely found. And unfortunately, we don't have many programs that work this way. And that's why many of the mentoring programs are not effective, at least not effective in improving access to higher education, which doesn't mean that they cannot be effective in emotional support in other ways, as was mentioned by Oscar and Bernardine. But if the goal is reducing inequalities in access to higher education, then different factors have to be combined at the same time. Thank you.
Now, that is a bomb that you threw into the discussion here, Agnes, and a lot of content again. So okay, this is a field that I'm very much into, to create equality in higher educations, because I've been seeing so many mentees in the past years. But do I understand what you are pleading for, that basically providing guidance before and during higher education is just one of the 3 elements that is very important? That's what you're pleading for, right?
Yes, all right.
And then within the field of providing guidance, you mentioned that a lot of pitfalls, I think that's what it's called in English. If I understand it correctly, you wouldn't like to have such short-term characters. I love that. Mm-hmm. And the coordination, better collaboration with schools, right?
Yes.
I think that really much connects to one of the chat questions.
I cannot see the chat. So that's,
right, Mattia? Yeah. There was something about the negative effects of mentoring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that your final comment could make a link to one of these questions that Frederic in the audience was asking about. Are there also negative factors in how we organize mentoring, a negative effect? I will give the word in a moment to Oscar, but perhaps you can mention this again, Agnes, that in program organization, there can be negative features in reaching a better impact, as you say, short-term or lack of collaboration with schools.
Yes, I mentioned some of, I think, our key structural factors that intervene in mentoring. I also think there are pedagogical factors in the way mentoring is conducted, but of course, as a sociologist, I mostly focus on these more structural factors. I mentioned one more qualitative dimension when I use this strong term about symbolic violence, because one of the things I found is that some of the initial programs that were launched involve students from very prestigious institutions that were working with very lower class students. And in many ways, they did not realize how much the things they say and how easy they show things to be was a kind of symbolic violence for the students. It's just they did not have the pedagogical training to understand that it was not just automatic identification that will work. So I think there is a need for a lot of training for the people involved in these programs, both training in a sense of cognitive training in some aspects that students need help, cognitive help, but also in the more emotional and personal dimensions. And we have to be careful about this, because higher education students are very cheap. Frequently, I mean, it's a labor force that doesn't have any cost, because even they are rewarded with their grades or some kind of symbolic rewarding. But it doesn't mean that, and they have a lot of motivation and energy, and I think they can be very important in the process, but they need to be trained. It's nothing automatic about that, having them intervene in the programs. So,
Agnes, I'm not sure if I agree with you as a practitioner, if it's due to the fact that they are cheap. I also hear from many countries, especially from France, that if you want to match very young people or very vulnerable people, it's easier to gain the trust than when you're older. But that's something.
Yes, well, I totally agree. And I think that young students are very happy, in fact, to meet with the students. But I think there is a difference between having a good contact and just learning something. So I think we have to be careful about that. Yes, I think there is this identification process, but sometimes it works well. And some students have like natural pedagogical skills, but some others don't. And I think we have to be careful about that. It's just, of course, they cannot become teachers, but we do have to provide some training for them.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting voice you mentioned, because I know that the French group of people who help us on a European level to do advocacy, that we very often talk about how to improve the soft skills of university students, transversal skills, which they need for their future being an employer as well. Mm-hmm. This mentoring relationship, and I agree with you. If it's not trained, then you miss the whole point. Yeah, I love it. Oscar, would you also react to the negative possible?
Yeah. Actually, what Agnes was saying is related to the negative effects or the iatrogenic effects of that mentoring can have. No? For example, if there is a group of mentors that are not trained, and they commit during 1 year to mentor to have a mentoring relationship with a mentee from a low-income background. If they act as a white savior, if they for example, lose commitment because the relationship was not as expected. So there are a lot of issues that are making the commitment of the mentors weak. And vulnerable youth, are people who have had a lot of difficulties in relation building with other people, especially with other class, social class groups and formal relationship with the institutions. No, so if you add at the top of all these situations, vulnerable situations, another one, you are creating a bigger negative effect. You know, you are adding another negative relationship to those that people have been accumulated over the years. So this is part of the negative effect of a mentoring program. And another thing that is connected to this is that there's an interesting research in the United States that successful Latina higher educational students went to some neighborhoods to do mentors and role models of other Latinas, youth Latinas. And as they were just saying, you can do it, and they were not doing a proper, let's say, identification of the challenges and the structural barriers that these youth are facing during their educational trajectory, these youth were having a lot of frustration because they were saying, you can do it, it's an inspirational mentoring relationship, but on the other side, the reality is the opposite. They are facing a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges, facing a lot of inequality and structural inequalities. And one thing is that the ethics of, we say sociologists, we say ethics of intention, and another one is the ethics of responsibility. So you need to have well-defined objectives in your mentoring programs, but at the same time, you may need to make sure that the mentoring relationship and the outcomes are connected to these intentions.
Oscar, hold on. Is there such a concept? You say ethics of intention and ethics of responsibility. This is something.
Yeah, the distinction between ethics of intentions and ethics of responsibility. So as an intention, you say, I'm going to do this program because we aim to do this goal. But we don't know the effects. Maybe the effects are the contrary, or the consequences are, you have unintended consequences, no, of your action, no, for example. So we need to make sure as people to have, as practitioners, no, and researchers as well, that we are working together in the field, that the effects and the outcomes of the mentoring are connected to those aims and intentions as much as we can.
Oscar, I just love this statement that you dropped about this Latino research, that you said that you can do it attitude doesn't work. These are, I mean, perhaps these are all obvious things, but we so little talk about this when we sit down also as matchmakers or with mentors. Do we bring that actually in words, that just to say to your mentee, you can do it, that doesn't work. You have to acknowledge their own situation and what they are stuck with or struggling with.
Or create activities within the mentoring relationship in which the mentee could identify together with their mentors these barriers, challenges that they are facing in their everyday life, and try to get that knowledge in order to face those challenges.
And then we get to the empathy story that you guys talk about there, Nadine, all the time, how important it is for the mentors to develop a high sense of empathy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I just want to say I agree with everything that's been said just about the barriers. And I think that's, you know, the policy, I suppose when we talk about researching mentoring, there's a bigger policy context there that sometimes mentoring is used for specific policy objectives that, you know, young people end up being collateral damage in, you know, in the process, which is definitely not acceptable. And just to say, Renee Spencer and colleagues have recently published a study just about social class bias in youth mentoring relationships, and they interviewed mentors, and they found, I suppose, a lot of evidence of implicit bias around and judgments around related to social class, and a lack of awareness of you know, the structural barriers that young people were facing. So I think, you know, the mentoring literature is starting to be a lot more aware of these types of issues, which are hugely important. But yeah, on the I suppose, in terms, just a final point, I suppose, about harm, just from the body of research, it's really clear that you need to have really good quality program practices in place to prevent these types of things from happening. So, for example, you need really good screening of volunteers, that they're coming into it with the right expectations, that they don't think they're not coming into it to save a child or whatever the case may be. So it's really important that there's good, you know, screening mechanisms around people's attitudes, that they're not given the freedom to basically do harm, you know, and also, you know, around child protection as well. Also, I think it's really important to have really good processes around making a match, that you have similar interests and dynamics in the relationship, you know, and then other things like really good training, good support and supervision and troubleshooting, a lot of emphasis on relationship building and those kinds of things. So like the research evidence is very strong that the more of these good practice elements the program adheres to, the less likely you are to do harm, and, you know, the more likely you are to have positive benefits. So, you know, I think the body of research is fairly unequivocal about that at the so yeah, so that's just worth bearing in mind. Yeah, and no, your question about empathy, Sylvia, yeah, I think sometimes, I suppose, again, it comes back to this risk of doing harm. Sometimes there's a lot going on, you know, in the mentor's life, in the program, and there's a buzz around a mentoring, getting involved in this, and you can put it on your CV, but at the end of the day, it's a relationship with a vulnerable young person, and you know, it's so important that the mentor just, I suppose, is there for the young person, listens to them, you know, has empathy. Just I suppose we did, myself and my colleague Pat Dolan did a chapter in a book that Oscar edited recently, and we talk about this approach called a presence approach.
Yes.
Where you know, rather than going in and trying to fix or to change the young person, that the mentor is there for the young person, and just, I suppose, takes them on their own terms and doesn't try to fix them, but just mostly focuses on friendship. But the other outcomes will actually emerge even if you do this. It's not that you're giving up. It's just that I think it's just that it's just a different way of approaching it, and potentially a more effective way.
Thanks, Bernardine. By the way, can I ask you both to type in the title of your books in the chat box? Oscar, I think your mentoring book is the most recent one in the mentoring field, right? It came out last year, I think. No? 2 years ago?
No, I think the same year than Bernardine's one.
Okay. Yeah, I see that Bernardine already put the book there in the chat. Oscar, would you also do that?
Yeah, I'll do it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we have new questions in the chat, Matthew is saying. Yeah, the one about the teachers and parents? Okay. So there was a question from Costa on what is the role of parents and teachers in mentoring? Perhaps Agnes, you can start it because you mentioned that collaboration with schools is important. So how to involve schools, teachers, parents in mentoring? How to connect the action?
Well, of course, I do think that collaboration is key, but once you have said that, it's very difficult sometimes to obtain collaboration. It's because the timing, for instance, if I talk about collaboration with schools, well, sometimes the timing of the program is very different. They are after school hours. They have different goals because in France, many teachers do not want to get involved in guidance because they don't consider it's their main task. They don't have a strong incentives to do that, and they have a very little training to do guidance. So they are not so interested sometimes in these mentoring programs, and they just delegate the work to these other actors that are intervening. So I think it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of thought about how to build a relationship with the school that is a lasting one. And what I mean with a relationship is not only that teachers know about the program or that they sometimes may participate at one point, it's also how they integrate their program into the teaching as well. And that I think is very hard, and I think it takes a lot of time and thought to do that. With the parents, of course, it's a different question. I think, of course, many times parents are not available, just don't have the time to devote to these programs. But I still think that it's important to engage them in giving them a lot of information about the programs, feedback about what's going on in the program, and of course, a small group of them can be closer to the program and participate in different ways and support also their children at home. So yes, I think it's important to build a large network around students because the programs is only a small part of their life. And so it's very important that other key actors in their lives, their parents, their teachers, are also involved and concerned with the program. But it's easier to say that than to build that relationship. And once the people are involved in the program, they have their own agenda, they have their own time schedule, etc. So they frequently, when they plan the program, they don't plan all this necessary time to build these relationships. So I think it's important to have this kind of large view about what the mentoring program should be.
Yeah, I love that. I learned from one of our US friends in mentoring, John Becker at the University of Massachusetts. She used to be involved in the execution of natural mentoring activities to teach young people how to attract and organize their own mentoring. And she said to me, my passion is to teach young people to, in a room full of role models, to teach them how to turn on the light so that they see that there are role models all over us, but they not always know how to recognize it and actively do something with it. Okay, there are more questions. Okay, a question to Agnes about Oscar. Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Just a brief addition to what Agnes was saying about the parental engagement and involvement. We have research from different colleagues in the field saying and attributing parental engagement to youth positive outcomes. So if parents are engaged in the mentoring relationship, positively engaged, I mean, youth outcomes are positive or more positive. So there is already evidence on that. And in some qualitative studies that we have carried out, we can see that as well. Because if you have parents involved and committed to the mentoring relationship, they create from their home, a space so the kid or the youngster could engage in these activities more easily. Otherwise, this is a program that is not, it's unknown for some parents, and some parents say to the kid or to the youth, you shouldn't be with your grandmother right now and not with that person. I don't know who is that person, no? Yeah. But as the parents are engaged, they know the mentors, they know the mentoring aims, and everything is more, the context is more positive in that way. Just that. Sorry.
And do you also see difference in age group in that, Oscar? Or is it very difficult to state, like what you're saying is more valid for younger kids or mentees?
Of course, we see more parental engagement in children of primary schools in Spain, in Catalonia specifically, than those in high school. Of course, yeah. There's a big gap in parental engagement, at least here in Catalonia and Spain.
I think there's a big gap in parental engagement for teenagers everywhere and in all fields.
Well, it depends because part of my work has also been these last years focusing on upper class parents' engagement in higher education, and it's really growing. How many parents go to higher education fairs? For instance, now in France, they are creating fairs specifically for parents that go to the fairs. So that's part of my research as well. And of course, many lower class parents, they haven't been to higher education. It's a very unknown world for them, so they don't feel they can engage. But it doesn't mean that they are not engaged. For instance, many lower class students that succeed in higher education, they have a strong moral support at home. And even if parents do not have enough knowledge to help them in a more cultural or cognitive way, they can still provide a lot of moral support for the students. And that really makes a difference. Students that talk a lot to their parents, that explain their problems to their parents, etc. So there is still a role for the parents, even if they don't master the system of higher education.
I also see about language barrier. I see a comment here about that language can be a barrier sometimes to involve parents or in a mentoring relationship. I don't know if you see any.
Yes, of course, language is a very important factor. And also, of course, the fact that some people have been raised in other systems which are quite different. So it's very difficult to transfer the knowledge to have one system to the French system, for instance. So yes, I think we have to be very much aware of this before having a negative discourse about lack of parental engagement. Is what are all these barriers to parental engagement.
Okay, people, we've been working really hard, and we are approaching the end of the session. So I would like to just encourage the audience to raise your questions so that we can pay some attention to it. I see a question about digital mentoring, which is quite interesting at these times. I know that there is very little research on it, but do you guys have anything that you can share with practitioners here on recommendations about digital mentoring?
Yeah, I can come in. Yeah, so as you say, Sylvia, there's very little research has been done, and I suppose one of the things, I suppose when we talk about digital mentoring, it can mean a lot of different things as well. So it can mean mentoring that's fully online, where the match don't meet at all, or it can be a blended approach. So I suppose one of the key points, we need a lot more research evidence. I suppose I know that there has been a lot of moves to develop specific mentoring platforms that can be used to support the relationship. So I know from some of our own research that I suppose one of the barriers around engaging online is having a platform that you can use for different purposes, you know. So if you're using, the young person mightn't have access to a computer, for example, they may just have a phone. So you need to have technology that's accessible and useful and that has a variety of functionality. So I know in Ireland, the mentoring organisation is currently piloting a specially designed platform that they've worked on with organisations in Australia, and it has built-in tools that allow for relationship building and games and getting to know you and things like that. Because I suppose one of the risks with digital mentoring is that relationship building is a little bit more difficult, because we know from our own research that what the young people enjoy is being able to get out and about, to go to a football match, to go to window shopping, to go for hot chocolate, and they build a relationship in that way, whereas it can be very strained if you're just sitting looking at somebody on a screen. So yeah, I think there's lots of challenges, but there's also a good bit of potential. And I think it's probably a little bit like most of our experience of education being forced to pivot online during the pandemic. I think we're all coming to the realization that there is a role for digital and there is a role for online, but we also need face-to-face. So a blended is usually the best approach, you know. So
I very much agree, Bernadine, very much agree. Okay, people, I would like to kind of collect the final comments or recommendations to the field. So a bit of a positive tone on, or recommendations of you from your side on how to increase our quality or how to grow, how to collaborate better. So anything kind of like a final voice on how to grow our mentoring activities across France and across Europe. Agnes, could I start with you? What would be your recommendation to us?
Well, as I said before, I think it's just to be extremely careful about the conditions that are necessary for a program to be successful, even conditions that are outside the scope of the mentoring program. Like if you just use the mentoring program and you don't change for instance, the selection mechanism into higher education, then of course the chances that the program will really reduce the inequality will be very lower. Also, the financial question is key. We know that many students, even if they are offered a place, if they go through the selection process, many times the financial barriers are very important as well. And as I say, support doesn't end when you access the institution. It's very important to support students in higher education. And this is very difficult because in France, some universities have tried to do that. But if you give very generic type of support, it doesn't work. And if you give very personalized support, it's quite costly, because then you have to have many human resources to have these types of programs. But it's very important if we want to support the success of lower class students. You don't need to support them for the whole higher education, but the first year, for instance, is a key stage in higher education. So it will be at least for the first 6 months, get a lot of support from the outside. So that will be my general view concerning just mentoring in access to higher education. Of course, you can do mentoring at different levels, and it doesn't take exactly the same shape.
No, I recognize what you say, because Oscar was talking about transitional mentoring, and I think very much so that we think of it as like just in the first situation and then arriving in the new situation, but sometimes we tend to end it a tiny bit too early. So I think you're right about that. It must continue. Okay, thank you, Agnes. Any recommendations, Oscar, from your experience?
I would recommend, especially when you start a program or you are in a process of scaling up, because you in France, I see that you are experiencing a very a big emergence of funding, and scaling up process of a lot of programs. No, you want to increase, to maximize the number of pairs and so on. I would suggest don't go so fast, which is not difficult, no, because funding depends on the number of pairs. But I would suggest to try to do the pilots, to try to establish a quality criteria with reduced mentoring number of mentoring pairs, and to try to build alliances and networks with universities, research practitioners, partnerships, in order to ensure that what you are doing in a small size mentoring program can be scaled up, no, afterwards. I think that is my recommendation.
Great that you mentioned this, Oscar, because of course we know the French ambitions, so very good that you say so, but for everybody to be, yeah. Thank you. Bernardine?
Yeah, I suppose if I was to recommend something, it would be probably to work towards some kind of common standards for mentoring programs in terms of quality. You know, because like Agnes described, there's a lot of different policies and practices, and it's probably not good enough. You know, so I think probably if there was some kind of process around agreeing minimum standards based on research, and then, as Oscar says, working with researchers and evaluators just around fine-tuning them and updating them and that kind of thing. But I think there's probably enough known from research already to establish a set of guidelines or good practice minimum standards that can then be built on for the French specific culture, you know.
The big dream of all of us to be able to do that. I know, Bernardine. Okay, let's take a look at, that's definitely, hopefully gonna be the next step in Europe. I see a big compliment there indeed, so that's very good to see. I don't see any new questions, so I would like to greatly thank you guys to bring this tremendous amount of knowledge and very clear recommendations for practice. So we can do a lot with it. I'm glad it's recorded so that we can even just dive into it and take out the most important ones for our own practice. Fantastic. And I see more thank you in the audience, so that's good. So let's leave it at this. And I think we can close down the session now and see you, hopefully see you in May in the Netherlands for the European Mentoring Summit. And I definitely hope that Bernardine and Oscar will be there as main researchers in mentoring. And Agnes, I will definitely reach out to join us and be a keynote after this contribution and getting to know you. So thank you all. Mattia, would you help me how to end this session? And then we stay in touch. Bye, people.
Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.